Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Kris. This is not brand new. 2 days old. This is Kings and Generals, the real causes of the War of 1812. Now I'm excited because War of 1812 isn't really talked about a whole lot. And I am finishing volume 1 of Andrew Jackson, and the Battle of New Orleans just took place. Well, it's over. And he's invading Spanish-controlled Florida, but that's neither here nor there for this video. All right, so before we get started, if you can click that thumbs up like I did, subscribe to the channel if you like the content, and click on the thanks button if you want to donate to the channel, optional. All right, let's get into the real causes of the War of 1812. I'm going to guess it has something to do. You thought I froze, didn't you? All right.
While the 1783 Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution, it did not resolve the tension between the British Empire and the new nation born of its erstwhile 13 colonies. Numerous disputes between Britain and the United States remained unresolved, and vagueness in the treaty itself created new problems. While efforts were made to solve the substantive issues, nothing was ever done about the underlying tensions. However, it was the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe that finally caused the tensions between England and her prodigal son to boil over in the New World. Welcome to the start of our series on the War of 1812, an often overlooked chapter in American military history, yet one that nonetheless played a fundamental role in shaping the identities of both the modern American and Canadian nations. In this first episode, we will explain the factors that led to the outbreak of war between a young, scrappy republic and the world's largest colonial juggernaut. Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us on uploading the salary joined by 1812 began with flaws for making this possible? The road to the War of 1812 began with flaws in the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which had formally introduced the independent United States of America into the international community. The treaty did a poor job of establishing the new border between the United States and British North America. It also failed to define cross-border commercial rights, leading to constant trade disputes. Additionally, West Florida remained in administrative limbo, as ambiguities in treaty language and British administrative practices led to it being ceded to both Spain and the United States.
I just wanted him to stop talking. The disputed territory had been part of the French Louisiana before Britain gained it in 1763. It had subsequently been administered from British West Florida. Britain ceded it to Spain as part of West Florida and to the U.S. as part of the Indian Reserve. I know that one of the issues was regarding the sale of the Louisiana Purchase, even though that was in 1803. But the sale of the... they're not getting to it yet. Well, I'll...
Britain refused to clarify the discrepancies, which led to friction between the US and Spain that was not resolved until 1795. Additionally, neither side fully upheld
it wasn't really solved even in 1795. There was always the hatred after the war of Britain, British to the north and Spain to the south, and in the west, surrounded by two potential rivals. And the only reason why Spain got involved in the Revolutionary War was because France told them they would help them fight and win and take back Gibraltar, which did not happen.
Their treaty obligation.
And I think there was a little part of, not hatred, but upset that it didn't work out. They had gotten involved to help the now U.S. And I think there was a little disgust and kind of, well, the U.S. is the reason why we didn't get Gibraltar back, not because they didn't win.
Both the United States and the United Kingdom were required to pay all debts owed to each other's citizens and allow civil lawsuits to recover war-related damages. However, neither was enthusiastic about actually doing so and were deliberately dragging out the court cases. The Confederation Congress had additionally agreed to prevent further expulsion of British loyalists and confiscation of their property, while earnestly recommending the state legislatures recognise loyalist property rights and provide compensation and restitution for seized property. Congress had done the latter, but the states ignored these measures and continued to confiscate the property of loyal colonials to pay war debts. In retaliation for these confiscations, the British interfered with US shipping in the Caribbean. Worse, they refused to evacuate 8 forts in US territory along the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain, and increased support for the Northwestern Confederacy, an alliance of indigenous tribes which provided a major barrier against American inland expansion.
Go back. Kaskaskia was the original capital of Illinois when Illinois becomes a territory in 1818. It was on the Illinois side, and then there was a earthquake, I believe, that changed the route of the Mississippi and cut it off from Illinois. So today, Kaskaskia is on the west side of the Mississippi, but it's still attached to Missouri, but still a part of Illinois. I think we can give that up. Cahokia Mounds is in this area of St. Louis, and that's where I went. That's where all the earthen mounds are. I did a short on that about the civilization that was there. And Fort Vincennes is where George Rogers Clark fought and took over the fort there. I went to what is now, George Rogers Clark Monument. I don't know why I keep circling it. But there's also William Henry Harrison's home where he sat down and met with Tecumseh. But George Rogers Clark conquered the fort there and then went over to Kaskaskia. So, and that's the Illinois River, Mississippi River. I'm somewhere around there. All right, back to the video. Sorry, just throwing some odd end stats in there.
Indigenous tribes, which provided a major barrier against American inland expansion. The Articles of Confederation left Congress too weak to respond effectively to these provocative acts, and the British ignored their protests. When the Northwest Indian War broke out, the British not only sent overt materiel and diplomatic support to the native tribes, but also semi-covertly deployed British and Canadian militias to fight alongside them. When it seemed the Americans would lose the Northwest Territory, the British built Fort Miami outside modern Toledo to reclaim the region. However, when Mad Anthony Wayne's Legion of the United States decisively defeated the Native Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the British refused to open Fort Miami's gates to fleeing warriors. London couldn't risk another war by openly supporting their allies, even though it cost the Confederacy the war and Britain a chance to reclaim the Northwest Territory. Cornered and humiliated, London finally agreed to resolve the commercial issues and some border disputes via the Jay Treaty, and withdrew from all 9 forts and stopped supporting the tribes in American territory.
A lot of people hated the Jay Treaty. John Jay, sent over by Washington. John Jay was our first Supreme Court Chief Justice, later resigned and became, I think, governor of New York. People hated it. James Monroe was sent over to do a treaty with France, and his treaty was, I guess, pretty decent, but they were trying to get a treaty with the British to get them out of America, and they shouldn't have sent Monroe over, because Monroe's treaty was kind of stomping all over Jay's treaty. Jay's treaty was stomping all over Monroe's. It was stupid, and he got reprimanded. He got brought back and reprimanded for doing his job by Washington, which I thought was stupid.
Relations were cordial though tense during the 10 years the Jay Treaty was in force. However, President Thomas Jefferson rejected a new treaty in 1806. This was primarily because he personally hated the British and wanted an antagonistic relationship with them and an amicable one with France.
he loved France. He was serving over there during the French Revolution. He kind of became, what's the word I'm trying to think? Not weaponized, radicalized because of his time over in France. And so when he came over, he really had a dislike of the British. And a young congressman serving at the time was Andrew Jackson, who will become big later on. He also did not like, obviously, dealing with the wounds that he suffered during the Revolutionary War. He also was not a fan of the British.
His Democratic Republican Party was fervently anti-British, not only because of old grievances, but because its rival, the Federalist Party, was dedicatedly pro-British. His secondary reason was that the treaty didn't address British policies that were harming American commerce. At the time, neutral nations had an absolute right to trade with belligerent nations, and their ships and cargo were inviolable unless trying to bypass a blockade. The United States had been doing brisk business with all sides of the French Revolutionary Wars, and expected to keep doing so when the Napoleonic Wars broke out. But Britain disagreed. Britain's only means of fighting Napoleon was commercial warfare via the Royal Navy. As the United States conducted only maritime trade with Europe, blockades and seizures would affect it far more than anyone else, but that was an acceptable risk. London didn't want conflict with the United States, but if that's what it took to defeat Napoleon, then so be it. It began in the 1790s with inconsistent enforcement of the Rule of 1756, which stated that cargo bound for British-controlled ports that wasn't traded in wartime couldn't be traded in peacetime. London's merchants had been relentlessly complaining about American merchants outcompeting them, and wanted the Royal Navy to drive the Americans off and to restore Britain to commercial primacy. Parliament preferred not to intervene, as the free trade with the United States was both incredibly profitable and a critical source of war materiel. However, the merchants' political lobbying was ultimately unignorable. Re-implementing the 1756 rule quietened the merchants, while the Americans weren't annoyed enough to stop trading with Britain, as the Royal Navy and port officials only occasionally enforced it. However, harassment soon turned into impressment or forced naval enlistment. As detailed in our series on Thomas Cochrane, conditions in the Royal Navy were terrible, and the fleet's rapid wartime expansion left most ships severely undercrewed. According to British law, any British seafarer could be pressed into naval service during wartime. Moreover, another law stated that anyone born under British jurisdiction was a British citizen, regardless of where they currently lived. However, American law stated that anyone who lived in the US long enough would gain American citizenship, with the specifics left to the individual states. Neither country recognized the other's definition of citizenship. As far as Britain was concerned, thousands of desperately needed potential sailors were hiding in the US. Britain was correct. US Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin estimated that half of US merchant sailors were British subjects, with Royal Navy deserters serving in both the merchant service and the United States Navy. The desperate situation in the Royal Navy led the British to take drastic action. It started with British deserters being hauled off during the Rule of 1756 inspections, but soon entire crews were being impressed off American merchant ships. The Royal Navy has always maintained that it only impressed British citizens, but historians have found plenty of reason to doubt the claim. Regardless, those men kidnapped into service were considered American citizens by the US and British citizens by the British. Washington could only protest these press gangings weakly, partly because London was just ignoring them anyway, and partly due to internal politics. Despite being the most affected by Britain's commercial warfare with France, New England didn't want to jeopardize the extremely profitable wartime trade it had with Britain. Losing sailors and cargo to the Royal Navy was annoying, but not enough to threaten their profits. However, impressment became so common that the British and American ships began fleeing at the sight of Royal Navy warships and beaching themselves to avoid Royal Navy press gangs. The situation escalated in 1807. Napoleon had defeated two more coalitions and instituted his continental system, which embargoed British trade and worsened the Royal Navy's manpower crisis. The Tory government hardened its conviction that drastic action was necessary. A new set of orders in council extended the British blockade. London separately ordered the Royal Navy to locate and retrieve deserters, no matter the consequences. Consequently, a squadron of British warships stationed in Chesapeake Bay blockaded several French warships in the American harbour of Baltimore. The squadron had already lost dozens of sailors to desertion, and the local British consul had been badgering US officials about returning them. However, most of the known ones were US residents, if not full citizens, and there were standing orders to protect them. British citizens were not turned over out of spite. On June 22nd, USS Chesapeake put to sea. On board were 4 Royal Navy deserters, 3 of whom were US residents. The British consul alerted the RN squadron, and HMS Leopard was dispatched to recover the deserters. When confronted, Commodore James Barron answered non-committally per standing orders. Incensed by the dismissal, Leopard fired on Chesapeake, which was not at battle stations, killing 3 and wounding 18. Leopard then boarded, and the 4 targeted deserters were hauled off in chains. This incident sparked.
Wait a minute. Radford was hanged. The other 3 were forced back into service. Art note, elected in 1808, the 4th U.S. president. What? Oh, okay. We're on to James Madison now? Because Jefferson served, I think, until 1809. Okay.
Off in chains. This incident sparked fury among the American public. This was a clear violation of US sovereignty, and a clear sign that the British still thought that America was a colony to be pushed around. Mobs attacked Royal Navy personnel in several ports, while Jefferson sent his strongest protests to London and expelled several Royal Navy warships from American waters. Rather than apologize, London doubled down. Additional orders in council were issued, requiring all merchant shipping to stop in British ports for inspection, regardless of their final destination, or be seized.
So one of the things in the Jackson book that I was reading, they talk about the sale of the Louisiana Purchase. And on that purchase, Spain controlled that property, and they gave it to France. I don't remember now why. Was that because of the helping in the Revolutionary War? Anyways, it was always supposed to be you didn't sell it, you returned it to Spain. You couldn't sell it, you had to return it to Spain. And Napoleon was like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. And he just sold it. Spain kind of protested. England really protested. But then Spain acknowledged it and just kind of moved on. And they were going to keep their foothold in Florida. But they knew that the expanding west would also mean that they would want to expand south. And they kind of figured they're going to expand south eventually. But I think they okayed the sale, figuring now they're going to focus on west instead of south. A guy like Jackson, Jefferson, Madison, even Monroe when he was Secretary of State. Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Secretary of State. They didn't like the idea of Spain still having a foothold in the continent on the south when you have England in the north in Canada. That was another issue, and I think that sale went through in 1803, but they don't show it on the U.S. map. So I don't know.
Napoleon retaliated with the Milan Decree, stating that any ship that stopped in a British port would be seized. In 1809, British Ambassador David Erskine negotiated a resolution to the Chesapeake affair. He offered to make American shipping exempt from the orders in council, but Foreign Secretary George Canning recalled him and ended all negotiations with the US. The US did not effectively respond, and tensions continued to rise. Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party strongly disliked standing militaries and refused to expand the tiny US Army. The Navy was allowed to grow slightly, but Jefferson became enamored by the idea of fleets of small gunboats using fire and maneuver tactics to overwhelm larger ships, and put most of the money into this Mosquito fleet. Unable to respond militarily, Jefferson and then James Madison attempted to use economic coercion against Britain and France. Both presidents believed that the combatants needed American trade far more than they actually did, and consequently withheld that trade. It completely backfired. Neither Britain's nor France's economies were appreciably disrupted, while the US suffered an economic depression.
Yeah, that boycott just killed the exports to the countries that are buying your stuff. And they were not happy relatively fast. James Madison steps in and wants to keep the same thing going, but he realized, this is not good. It's not going to work.
New England howled that none of the acts were intended to solve the crisis, but were just political reprisals against the Federalists. The British and French made trade difficult, but it was still possible and profitable. Jefferson and Madison had made it impossible and completely shut down their commercial economies. Worsening the sectarian split, the Democratic Republicans from the South and West were shouting increasingly loudly for war. There had been calls to drive the British from the continent since the Revolution, but the 1810 midterm elections made Henry Clay, the Warhawks leader, Speaker of the House. The Warhawks wanted war primarily to defend America's honor, but they were also looking to annex all of Canada.
Henry Clay was a Warhawk, so was John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. They were the two biggest. There's a few other names, and they just slipped my mind.
This was not just for territorial expansion, but to stop the British from arming the native tribes still resisting US expansion. Around this time, a new charismatic native chieftain named Tecumseh had arisen among the Shawnee people and was creating a new grand alliance of native tribes. This added urgency to the American Warhawks' cries for war with Britain, even after a US army, led by Indiana Governor William Henry Harrison, had won a major victory against Tecumseh's tribal alliance at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811.
Had William Henry Harrison not gotten disgusted with the military service and he stayed, Andrew Jackson does not move up the ranks that he does. Probably still stays in the South because he was in Tennessee, and he did go down to Alabama in Fort Mims because of the Fort Mims massacre. New Orleans, Mobile. He really wanted to go into Pensacola. But he wanted to stay in that area. William Henry Harrison doesn't resign in disgust. Andrew Jackson doesn't, because Andrew Jackson had a kindred spirit in James Monroe, who was on the same page with him in terms of not wanting the Spanish in Florida, figuring the British were going to try to seal up the mouth of the Mississippi. And if they were able to get a foothold into the Mississippi, if the war ends, they have a strong position to basically say, you don't get anything on the west of the Mississippi. Your expansion stops here because we're going to get involved now.
The debate over just how much of a priority the US annexation of Canada was is not yet settled. There were numerous American politicians.
Sorry. It is still debated how important the annexation of Canada really was as a war priority for the United States. Yeah, it was zero. They just wanted it. They wanted it dating back to the Revolutionary War. They wanted it because they couldn't get it. We got to have it. It's like a kid and a toy. It's mine. I want that. It's mine. I'm crying over it. It's mine. It's mine. That's exactly what the Americans did for Canada.
Annexation of Canada is not yet settled. There were numerous American politicians openly calling to invade and annex Canada, but it isn't clear that it was an actual American war goal.
It was because they wanted to boot the British out of it. I do sincerely believe that.
like J.C.A. Stagg and Alfred Leroy Burt have argued that America never intended to keep any Canadian land. In contrast,
I'm going to disagree with that. I'm going to disagree with that and say that anything that they would have taken during the war, they would have tried to keep. All of Canada, probably not. New York area up around to Michigan and stuff like that, yeah. Anything that they could have taken, they would have. How far north? Don't know.
others, like Lewis M. Hacker and Alan Taylor, think territorial acquisition was the primary motivation. The controversy...
Alan Taylor, by the way, great author. That's, yeah, I would side with on that. Anything that they would get, they didn't need all of it. They just wanted the territory. Like if they could have gotten all the way up to here, probably around that river and over and maybe to like there, that's what they would have wanted. Or of course, you know, back then maybe all of this down to the river and then maybe across to there. They would have wanted all of this land in here, probably originally. But like I say, they had the Louisiana Purchase, so all this they already had. So I don't know why that's not highlighted, because they would have loved to probably have gotten into this. But I don't think there was any war situation over here. It was all over in this area.
Stems from the fact that invading British North America was the only way for the US to prosecute its war against Britain. If Napoleonic France couldn't invade the island of Britain proper, America had no chance. Thus, their only option was to invade and conquer Britain's remaining North American colonies of Upper and Lower Canada, even if it didn't intend to keep them. Additionally, numerous statements by President Madison and others in his government indicated that they believed Canada was the key to feeding Britain's far more valuable Caribbean colonies. Madison therefore believed that starving the Caribbean would force Britain to the peace table faster than actually conquering Canada. However, he was also on record stating that if the invasion went particularly well, the US would try to acquire territory to weaken the British and stop them from arming enemy tribes. Territorial acquisition was likely seen as a benefit of war, but not a reason for war.
If these are all the locations that the British are at, that they're using to send military equipment into this region, then the Americans want it. They want all this area, because now you've got to span further distances or go around the Great Lakes to come down. So yeah, if they could have taken this, 100% believe, my opinion, they're keeping it.
Meanwhile, it's not clear what effect America's conquering all of British North America would have had on Tecumseh's military power. There's also considerable ambiguity about what London's policy for Tecumseh's Confederacy actually was. It is incontrovertible that native warriors in the Northwest Territory were receiving British arms, and that Major General Isaac Brock was materially supporting Tecumseh and making alliances with other native resistance leaders. However, native factions in the Old Northwest were receiving arms from the Americans as well, while Tecumseh never fully trusted the British, having been double-crossed by them before at the Battle of Fallen Timbers.
And he had seen a history of native people, French and Indian War, fighting on the British side, and then not getting things that they wanted after the war. Revolutionary War, fighting on the British side, and then just basically being pushed aside afterwards. Helping in Pontiac's war. There was and this war, there was a lot of things that they did to help. And then when it came down to now their turn to get help, the British turned their back on him. Kind of screwed him over. But, you know, in America, that's something that Americans get blamed for all that. The British get a you know, clean slate. That didn't happen. That's a whatever. It's always, you know, the Americans do bad. All the other countries that were involved in having them fight a proxy war for them, like Spain, like Britain, like France, it was the Americans.
Firstly, while British military officials gave thousands of weapons, tools, and other military supplies to native tribes fighting the Americans pre-1812, the numbers paled in comparison to what the tribes acquired via the fur trade. The tribes knew the value Europeans put on furs, and often played American and Canadian fur traders off each other to get the best prices. Weapons were the most desirable trade goods, and tribal traders were raising their prices to ensure that trading guns and gunpowder was the only option to acquire valuable furs. While the records are sparse and the impact controversial, it appears that British direct weapons transfers did enough to buy Indian goodwill, but did not actually make them war-ready. Secondly, Tecumseh never forgot nor forgave Britain's betrayal at Fallen Timbers, and he expected them to betray him in turn. If another European power had been available, Tecumseh would have chosen them over the British. However, the only other option was distant and weak Spain, and his hope for a unified Indian nation required a strong European ally. He had to work with the British, but despite his immense personal respect for the colonial administrator Isaac Brock, whose bravery the Shawnee chieftain much admired, he only got as close to the British as necessary and was eternally looking over his shoulder. Tecumseh was not wrong to suspect the motivations of his fair-weather allies. To the British, the natives were a means to an end. Defending its Canadian territories, or more accurately, defending its access to the Canadian fur trade, was Britain's primary strategic concern. London believed that the formation of an Indian buffer state was key to defending Canada. Therefore, Tecumseh's dream was in Britain's strategic interest. However, London didn't actively work toward that dream. London wouldn't risk being caught directly helping the enemies of the US again. Still, it needed the natives to be sufficiently grateful for British help to become its satellite and buffer state. Thus, Brock and other officials were allowed to promise anything and everything to form tribal alliances, but could only fulfill limited requests for weapons and gunpowder. Even then, the allocations were often expanded or cut seemingly at random. Confused about London's intentions, Brock focused on strengthening the tribes on his side of the border, intending to use them as his first line of defense. Helping Tecumseh was a secondary concern. It is likely that the material support Tecumseh and other resistance leaders received from the British before 1812 didn't affect the outcome of their wars. However, the fact that Britain was still undeniably supporting active enemies of the United States was widely known. The Warhawks magnified, dramatized, and hyperbolized the—
That is Henry Clay, and that is John C. Calhoun. What am I thinking of? Hated Andrew Jackson because the way Andrew Jackson talked about the Kentuckians after the Battle of New Orleans, which he called them lazy, good-for-nothing people. Vice president of Andrew Jackson on his first term wanted South Carolina to secede, tried to put pressure on Jackson. Jackson basically told him that the Union would be, how did he phrase it? It was like 9 words. The Union will be saved in perpetuity or something like that. Basically then told that, South Carolina wants to secede, that they would just go through and kill every man, woman, and child, hang them from every available tree branch in the state, burn the entire state to the ground, and then refill it with patriots. So John C. Calhoun did not stick around for the second term. You could probably guess that.
This limited British support for Tecumseh to successfully whip up a public frenzy for war. The internal pressure was finally too much to ignore. With Britain still refusing to address US grievances or to curtail impressment, President James Madison delivered a special address to Congress on June 1, 1812. Without actually calling for war, Madison recounted the impacts of the Orders in Council, the impressment of US citizens, and British involvement with Tecumseh on the American economy and national honor, before noting that, under similar circumstances, Britain would have already declared war. Congress responded, and on June 18th, the United States issued its first ever declaration of war against Great Britain. Ironically, America's grievances were already being addressed without its knowledge. The Orders in Council were causing an economic depression in England almost as severe as the one the Americans had experienced. Thousands of unemployed manufacturers had rioted against them in the Midlands and the North, and Perceval's government finally began discussing their repeal. Then Perceval was assassinated over an unrelated and somewhat delusional personal grievance on May 11th. Fearing that an uprising might be fomenting and wanting to moderate its foreign policy, the new government abandoned Percival's hardline approach and suspended the Orders in Council on June 16th, pending full repeal. To further repair relations with the United States, London released the 2 surviving impressed sailors from the Chesapeake and paid for damaging the ship. It is likely the ships containing America's declaration of war and Britain's repeal of the Orders in Council passed each other in the Atlantic. Both governments learned of the other's moves in August and realized that the cause of the war was effectively solved. However, no orders were given, as both governments were waiting to see how the other responded and whether there'd really be a war or not. However, the decision was being made for them in the wilderness of the Great Lakes. In our next episode on the War of 1812, the embers of conflict will begin to spark along the frontier, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, subscribe.
Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed. I did. The War of 1812 is just it's a fascinating war because so much violence and bloodshed, and in the end, spoiler, nothing changed. All right. Well, we're going to end this here. Hope you enjoy. Until next time, have a good day. Have a good night.